Okay, I think that's probably gives everyone a chance to join. I'm sure there'll be people joining in the next couple of minutes, but we'll kick off. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest of our Life Sciences Live webinars. I'm Carol LePage and I am a tax partner here at BDO, but you'll be very glad to know I'm not here to talk about tax for once. Instead, we're going to be talking about remuneration trends in the life sciences sector. I'm joined by some great panelists today who have a wealth of experience to share with you in that space. First, we're going to hear from David Ellis, and David leads our remuneration strategy team here at BDO, and we'll spend the first 10 minutes or so just running through some trends and insights from market data. After that, there's going to be a panel discussion, and Dave and I will be joined by Paul Edwards. Paul is a managing partner at Sci Partners, who are a leader in providing executive search and interim specialist resource to businesses in the life sciences sector. And he's also a director, a non-executive director of OBN. We'll also be joined by Vicky Bright, who is a specialist in tax efficient share plans and employee reward. And also by Ian Oliver, who many of you will know leads our life sciences practice here at BDO. But actually today he's here with a different hat to cover some relevant accounting aspects instead. So there'll be a few minutes at the end where he's going to run through a slide or two on that, but he'll also be part of the panel discussion. If you've got any questions as you go, please do put them in the chat, and we will come to them either as the discussion progresses, or we've got some time set aside at the end for your questions as well. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to David.
Thanks very much, Carol. Hello all, it's lovely to be here and thank you for joining us. As Carol has said, I've got about 10 minutes worth of content, which really tries to position the conversation we're going to be having today over the next hour in some data. My experience is that people like to see data, but they generally can't cope with more than 10 minutes worth. So I'll do my best to make sure we cover that in the time we've got available. I should probably just say in a sentence, I mean, my day job is advising clients on rewards. So how much would you pay? Who would you give it to over what period of time? And for doing what or delivering what? And fundamentally, this conversation touches on all of those aspects. To get you some data that you will recognise and indeed that we can verify, what we focused on here is what is being paid to directors who sit within AIM-listed life sciences businesses. So we're not going to not talk about any other type of organisation, but we're going to position our conversation in that data. So if you wouldn't mind moving the slide on, Daniel, that would be wonderful. So let's just give you the answer before I show you some numbers. I mean, for all intents and purposes, we've cut our numbers for you here, looking at life sciences businesses who sit within the AIM 100, so the very largest AIM organisations, and life sciences businesses who sit outside of the AIM 100 and are conceptually therefore somewhat smaller. What we can see across both of those groupings of organisation is, maybe unsurprisingly, I'm not sure, we can see that pay has gone up between the last reported season of annual reports and the preceding season. And for all intents and purposes, much of that increase in pay is driven by long-term incentive plan outcomes being higher than they were previously, which again is not that much of a surprise because we've had some bits of pandemic in between, some grant periods and the ones that have happened latterly, meaning that vestings are possibly higher. There are some other things to note which I think are interesting. I mean, if you have a company with a closer nexus to the US, they would see that pay is higher. No surprises there at all, because pay levels in the US at the executive level bear little or no relation to pay levels in the UK or across Europe. So all that is simply telling us is that in a hybrid context where you have a business with a foot in both camps, you'll see a hybrid pay outcome with pay looking higher, but not reaching the levels that you would find in the US. The third thing it's worth noting, just in highlighting the kind of headlines that we see here, is that there is a greater focus on variable pay in life sciences organisations than you see in non-life sciences organisations, but not overwhelmingly so. I mean, where you do see an overwhelming trend, it's that pay mix is weighted towards bonus, short-term pay, rather than long-term outcomes. And in fairness, that's not necessarily because that's what organisations intended. It is simply because in AIM businesses, where share prices are sometimes somewhat illiquid, we see very lumpy or disparate vesting outcomes in a long-term incentive outcome, which actually tends to sway the disclosed data towards bonus outcomes rather than long-term incentive plan outcomes. It's not that they wouldn't like there to be higher long-term incentive plan outcomes, it's just that they are a bit patchier in terms of outcome. The final thing I just wanted to touch on is that there's again, it's not a difficult concept, it's just worth noting that where you have organisations who are in the development stage, there you will see pay reasonably lower than you will see for organisations which have a drug or a product on the market. Now, that's about preserving cash burn, obviously, in the simple premise that where you've got revenue coming into the business, you could pay in a different way to where you are developing and do not have that. So we can see that come through in the data. The reason that's important, of course, is that if an organisation is looking to compare itself to a business which is involved in a similar type of drug or a similar type of process, the fact that one may be more advanced in its cycle in terms of development will be the bigger influence on pay than the fact that they are involved in similar outcomes. So it's absolutely critical when we look to develop peer groups to work out who gets paid what, that we take those kind of questions into account. The geographical nexus, we take into account the stage of development, and we look at whether that long-term incentive outcome has been patchy or indeed is relatively fluid. So, Daniel, if you wouldn't mind pinning us on to the next slide, let's touch on some numbers so you can see in the stark cold light of day what that means. What this is telling you is what pay looks like at median level. So we've listed all the companies, we've taken the middle one out, and you can see that that's driven by the life sciences sector in the AIM 100 and in the AIM market as compared to all other AIM sectors. Now, there are some interesting things to note in this data. Firstly, and somewhat disappointingly, pay, practice and quantum, if one looks at the AIM 100, is pretty much identical across life sciences as compared to every other company in AIM. The reason that's disappointing, of course, is that the business cycle a life sciences entity is involved in bears no relation to the business cycle that any other entity may be involved in outside of the life sciences sector. Ideally, you'd like to see pay reflect that, but that's not what this data is showing us. The other things it tells us is that there are some fairly standard outcomes here that one would expect. As the company gets bigger, pay materially increases. So size is absolutely a product leading to pay outcome. And for all intents and purposes, you can see this standard kind of issue differential, I suppose, in pay between a CEO and a chief financial officer. So your CFO, generally in base pay terms, will be being paid something around 70% of what the CEO was paid. And again, that's pretty sector agnostic, to be honest. If we ping on to the next slide, let's keep pushing on rapidly and see where that takes us. This breaks down CEO pay into a little bit more detail, and you can see we've given you 3 quartiles of pay here: what it looks like at median, what it looks like at upper quartile, i.e. the 75th percentile in our comparator group, and what it looks like at lower quartile at the lower end. And again, it simply brings to life, I suppose, the points that we've touched on in summary thus far, which is broadly that salary is a product of size. So you can see AIM 100 has got a differential pay level to AIM outside of the AIM 100, and in the context of the pay overall, there is a disproportionate focus dependent upon where you find your organisation at the larger company level on variable pay versus fixed. But as you get smaller, the importance of fixed pay becomes disproportionately important. So the blend of the package looks different. If we have a quick look over the next slide, Daniel, at CFO pay, the story, whilst different in terms of numbers, is broadly telling us the same thing. Differentials in size of organisation, as you get smaller, much greater focus on fixed pay. From a larger business perspective, that bonus picture looks much more important. You'll see some vagaries in this data around the value of long-term incentives in packages. It's just worth taking a moment to touch on that very briefly. Base pay and bonus opportunity are relatively consistent year on year. Whether they should be or not is a different conversation. They usually are. What organisations, particularly in the life sciences sector, are generally struggling with is to look at what is an appropriate long-term incentive plan, policy and grant profile to be market competitive. And I think it's worth noting that whilst you can find good pay data in a salary and a bonus context, and you can find that across AIM businesses, fully listed, or indeed private companies for that matter, the data on long-term incentives is much more confusing to interpret. And that is simply because organisations are using different instruments, they valued them in different ways, the impact of performance has different outcomes, and conceptually what you're really going to have to do if you're looking at pay data for long-term incentive plan outcomes is apply a methodology or a piece of judgment to make sure from a top-down perspective and a bottom-up perspective you have got the right numbers you can base your decisions on. And we can help with that. So we can help with the methodology you would go through to use that data more effectively. But you can see the data that you are actually pulling out in terms of actuals tends to be a tiny bit patchy. So if we can flick onto the next slide, let's keep going. This is the data that shows you how pay differs between companies that have a drug in development or that is pre-development. And you can see, I mean, for all intents and purposes, it's chalk and cheese, to be perfectly honest. So there is no surprise there in the context of the impact that that makes. It's worth us moving on just to keep the trend going. This is our chart that shows you pay mix. So the chart on the left shows you the split between fixed pay and variable pay. And you can see the larger organizations in the AIM 100, we have a greater percentage of the package weighted to variable pay. What the chart on the right is showing us is the split between of that variable pay, that which is short term and that which is long term. And look at the extraordinary outcome you see here, which is whilst people are vexing themselves hugely around long-term incentive plan design, the actual outcomes from a data perspective, i.e. what is vested, unless you are a senior player in the very largest of companies, actually is very modest. And that is really important for us to note, goes to the root of that data question, what's a market competitive grant? Because on the premise of this data, it looks a tiny bit odd, but it doesn't mean that long-term incentive is not an important piece of this package. It means we need to be a lot more artful around how we construct how much to grant. I've got one other thing just to quickly cover, if I may. So Daniel, if you could ping us on. People are usually interested in how all of this story distills into how NEDs, non-executive directors, are paid. They are obviously paid in a completely different way usually, which involves a basic fee, perhaps with some enhancements for sitting on certain committees. Of course, in AIM, we do see some non-execs receive equity or participate in equity plans. AIM is a breed apart from the main market where you do not see that for matters of corporate governance. But what this is telling us ultimately is in the context of our data across the AIM 100 and AIM, that you can see a basic fee for a NED in the AIM 100 hits around 46k, and for an AIM business outside of the AIM 100, it's at that 30k level. For a chair in the AIM 100, that gets to 90, and for an AIM business, that's at 70. And practice around fees for specific committee representation, it's still a bit mixed on AIM, to be honest. It's much more prevalent across the full list, but for all intents and purposes, these numbers are usually cumulative. So for all intents and purposes, you would get an enhancement as a chair over your basic NED fee and some additional fees for attending certain committees. And for all intents and purposes, I guess it's just worth noting, because it's really important, we often see non-executive directors in this kind of business also receiving some sort of equity award. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing from an independence perspective, I'll kind of say it doesn't matter. That's what the practice is, so we should note that that is the case. Now, I know I've spoken phenomenally quickly because we wanted to get that out really as best we can so that we can position the conversation that flows thereafter. So I'm going to take a deep breath and sit back exhausted. Thank you, Carol.
That's great. Thanks ever so much, David. Some really, really interesting data there, I think, to sort of position the discussion that we're now going to have. So we have got about half an hour, probably a bit less, just to kind of have a discussion amongst the panelists and explore some themes and trends. And the thing that struck me, David, with the sort of data that you just run through, it is very AIM market focused. And it would be really interesting to get your take in terms of whether that translates into the sort of earlier stage life sciences businesses, for example, where they might be, PE backed or VC backed, etc.
So let me just say a sentence, and then it'll be super to hear what Paul has to say, who is at the coalface doing this day in, day out. I mean, for all intents and purposes, my experience would be that from a base pay perspective, compared between a smaller AIM business and an early stage business of a different funding orientation, they are not a million miles apart. And that's simply because there's generally a cost of doing business, which people need, a cost of existing, really, which substantively people are kind of reaching. What's very different, of course, is that variable piece of the package tends to be potentially more valuable, but the trade-off is it's potentially more uncertain in outcome. So there's a bigger gamble involved, a bigger risk, a bigger piece of entrepreneurialism in that earlier stage business to really, I mean, I guess it's fair to say, to make that an exciting proposition for people to do or want to be involved in. That would be my thought.
Yeah, Paul, it would be great to hear from you on that one too. Is that very in line with your take as well?
Yeah, I think it is. And the market data that David showed does reflect what we're seeing. Just if I talk in general to start with, there's no particular upward pressure on base salaries for the C-suite roles, CEOs, CFOs, head of commercial. Though what we are seeing is in some specialist roles where there may be a supply problem, such as things like regulatory affairs, pharmacovigilance. And that's tended to require higher salaries to complete recruitment. And we did mention that CFO salaries haven't particularly risen massively, although I think the exception to this is for CFOs with M&A experience. And this may be a reflection of biotech companies looking for an exit or PE-backed organizations who are looking to grow through acquisition. Obviously, with early stage biotech companies, yes, I mean, the package is quite different. It tends to be lower salary, high kind of share package, which, in a lot of companies won't come to anything, but obviously the potential to earn from that is quite huge. What we're seeing more and more that's happening, and this will be interesting for a discussion later on as well, is that what a lot of early biotech companies are doing, they're looking to bring in senior people who've got portfolio careers and to attract them on a part-time or contract basis. And the thought process behind this is say you're a preclinical single asset company and you're planning to outsource most of your activities, you still need to recruit experienced people to manage these activities, preclinical development, CMC, finance, or even the part-time CEO. And a neat solution is to employ them for, say, 1 to 2 days a week on either a part-time or contract basis. And obviously, people with a lot of experience can have a high day rate, and you tend to balance this off by granting shares to people, founder shares, if the person comes in early. But the problem that we are seeing in this is when granting share options to employees or consultants who come into the company maybe at a later stage, that it won't be possible to issue these options under a EMI scheme, and therefore will have quite a sizable tax burden. And I know companies such as BDO and so are looking at solutions to these issues. So yeah, I think what we're seeing on the ground is very much in line with what David said. Early stage companies, yes, the balance is different, the salaries are lower, but obviously the stock position that people are getting is a lot better. And just saying again, some of these specialist positions where there's a shortage is where we're seeing the upward salary pressure to get people.
That makes sense. So that long-term incentive piece then, particularly for these businesses, it is quite fundamental, is what I'm hearing. It's an important thing to get the right talent in the door. Absolutely, absolutely. That's perfect. And are we seeing any sort of wider trends outside of pay as well?
I mean, we are. I mean, and obviously the major trend we've seen post-COVID is the move to hybrid working and the reluctance amongst candidates to relocate. And let me give an example, just working with a specialty pharma client of mine, and they've recently made the following appointments: Chief Commercial Officer, Chief Scientific Officer, Head of Quality, Head of Pharmacovigilance. And none of those people have relocated, including 2 of whom live 200 miles from the headquarters. And obviously, as part of the package, the company is putting in travel and accommodation allowances, does require the people to be on site for 2 to 3 days for some of the jobs, although in other jobs, they're almost totally remote now. And that is a trend across the industry. And obviously roles such as manufacturing or running a lab or whatever would require a 5-day presence. But with many senior roles, you know, organizations are realizing that they have to have a requirement for people to be on site every day and therefore be required to relocate. If they're going to insist on that, they will obviously then have a lot greater reduced talent pool to fish in for those people, or have to pay a real premium. And that is probably the biggest change we've seen in 18 months. And it's really happened rapidly and has a lot of kind of knock-on effects as well, which we can talk about.
So has that actually changed, do you think, the geographical differences in overall remuneration as well? Because you hear about, say, London waiting, for example, and
yes,
things like that. Is that going, or is it kind of all equalising now, do you think?
Well, and I think we're at a stage where companies are having to get their head around this a little bit. You know, I'll give an example. You know, for someone who's based in the north of England, and they can get a job in London. Well, maybe the companies don't have to pay, you know, that big premium anymore, because people can stay in their hometown, travel down to London, you know, have the overnight accommodation allowance, but don't have to pay that premium on salary. And that works pretty well. Where we found 1 or 2 issues is when it happens in reverse. Is, you know, people, and there are regional differences. If you're generally working, and I'm sitting today in an office in Nottingham where the house prices, cost of living is lower, salaries have tended to be lower. But of course, if you're then attracting someone from London, even though they might be on a remote basis, they are still sitting within an environment where salaries tend to be higher, despite the fact that they haven't moved. And I think it's something where companies are still having to think that through, that they're having to look at their kind of organization, they're having to look at what becomes an attractive salary. So I don't think we've got the absolute answer for that, but it's something that really is evolving. That's a good question, Carol.
And David, is that in line with your experience too?
It absolutely is. So there's 2 things I would add. There's no question that there is still a clear differentiation between London and outside of London in absolute pay terms. What's much more confusing now is inter-regional differences, which are smoothing out really quite quickly, I think. So that's just worth noting. It's not that the whole of the UK has moved to 1 pay level. I don't think that's true, but there's much closer parity now between the north or the south west, and that's not what we used to see. The second thing is just worth touching on is that there are some obviously very big life sciences organisations that have been much more prescriptive about attitudes towards the office, and actually what that offers to a smaller organization is a huge competitive advantage for recruiting talent out of businesses who are requiring and mandating office presence when they don't need it or where they don't have to do it. So for all intents and purposes, size and flexibility is a huge differentiator in an employment proposition, particularly where there are big local competitors who are not offering that as a piece of flexibility. It's now a hygiene factor in a package, whereas it used to be, you know, icing on the cake. It's just not icing on the cake anymore. So use it to your advantage if you can, I would say.
I think you're absolutely right on that, David. It's almost become a competitive thing now. And I know companies are having serious sit downs, looking at what other companies are doing and actually trying to put the whole package together to make them competitive. I couldn't agree more.
And are we seeing similar sort of trends almost with people working internationally in the sector as well? Because you've got that kind of UK geographical flexibility now. Is that extending more broadly?
Yes, we are seeing that. But of course, one of the big challenges that companies then have, if you're sitting your company in Belgium or Netherlands and you want to recruit, but you're not insisting on person locating, and the person maybe is then going to sit in the UK, go over there occasionally. The biggest challenge is tax. And, that depends on how many days people are going to spend, whether they're going to have a house over there. So I know that's troubled people over the last couple of years. And I'm sure that's something that drops onto your plate from time to time as well.
Yeah, it does indeed. We're certainly seeing businesses needing to look increasingly globally for that talent, but the tax is always seen as a real, most a nuisance and a bit of a sort of aggregating factor. And there's this balance between attracting the talent and the cost of actually being compliant in that country. Yep. So yeah, definitely something I'm seeing a lot of. It's probably a good time to bring in Vicky, actually, just to share a few thoughts in terms of what you're seeing sort of both long-term incentive-wise and beyond on the tax efficient side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was really interesting, Paul, to hear what you're saying around, the startup or the early stage. You've got a lot more flexibility in terms of what can be offered in the life sciences sector. So you mentioned EMI, Enterprise Management Incentive, which is a government tax approved share plan, which ideally, if we're starting from a blank sheet of paper, every company would love to be in because it offers great tax benefits for the company and for the employee. But the issue of part-time employees does come into it with EMI, like you mentioned. So with an EMI, you need to work 25 hours a week, or that to be 75% of your working time. So having individuals work a couple of days a week for multiple companies or ad hoc doesn't really work, and particularly with the contractor side of things. So I would say that a kind of the next best alternative that has really started to ramp up since the 6th of April and some of the changes in the last budget is the CSOP, the company share option plan. So that used to be quite restrictive in terms of the shares that you could put under it and the kind of requirements. But it's changed since the 6th of April, which means we're seeing much more activity in the CSOP. So part-time individuals, as long as they're employees, can qualify under the CSOP for grants. You do, however, need to be either a full-time director or an employee. So then it kind of gives rise to the question of, is it better for individuals to be an employee or have that contractor status? So there is still that debate, but having £60,000 worth of options at the date of grant under the CSOP could be a really attractive alternative. I think, Carol, coming back to your question about sort of the tax and how important is that, I think for the life sciences and the smaller companies coming up, where you can qualify for something that has the tax efficiency, that's great. We do need to look at and consider kind of the companies and the individuals where if we don't qualify for something, what is next? So is that, you know, unapproved share options? Is that growth shares? And consider kind of the risk profile of the individuals, or, you know, maybe cash bonuses. You know, there's a lot of interesting research about what type of long-term incentive plans are kind of best for different generations. So all of that, I think, is taken into account and kind of feeds back into what David was saying earlier in terms of, you know, how we can help looking at the remuneration packages more broadly.
No, it's interesting, very interesting. And David, Paul, have you got any sort of comments and what you're seeing on that generational piece in particular?
It's just worth touching on, I think, and the AIM data we've had a little look at there is a really important piece of insight for us, really, which is the trouble with a long-term incentive is that the discount factor recipients apply to it is enormous, both in terms of deferred receipt, people rather things in the hand than later, and in terms of likelihood of receipt. Nobody likes a gamble. So for all intents and purposes, what we see, of course, is that pound for pound in terms of what hits the P&L, and Ian will touch on this in a second, I'm sure, these are very expensive bits of kit to give to people, but the actual value ascribed to them by the individual, absent it hitting and being a windfall and then just going thanks, is very low over that period over which it's being earned. So the trick to this, if that's an appropriate word to use, it clearly isn't for the avoidance of doubt, but let's just expect the fact I've used it, is for as vast a number of people as you can, how can you get the impact of these things to be as positive and immediate and certain as possible, because it produces for you an outcome which people will value more. So that's obviously why people like fixed pay, but why bonus tends to be more palatable for individuals at certain stages in their career, because looking on a 5-year horizon is just too difficult to do. So keep your LTI participation as tight as you dare, on the premise that actually it doesn't represent good spend for you if you're not careful. There, that's my thought.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing a little bit on the cash side of things with the CEOs, where if you're an early stage company where you're getting cash bonus triggers on things like, you know, if you raise a seed round, or if you raise an A round funding, or if you do a deal and things like that. So I think we are seeing a little bit more of a trend towards people, you know, looking for cash, but on the back of a trigger. So that's something we're seeing.
Yeah, and I guess in the sector, there are a lot of M&A transactions, aren't there, as products start to become successful, and the multiples you can get on that can be pretty large.
And just adding to that, I think one thing I'd really recommend if you're going down the share plan route is really key and frequent employee communication around what is in place, why it's important, the benefit of having it, whether you do that, at least annually, to give people a reminder, because ultimately it's never going to act as a kind of employee incentive if people have forgotten it and it's in a drawer somewhere. And that can be particularly the case for, kind of exit-based things. So if you've got EMI in place and it's for an exit, people usually value it on the day they receive it and they think, great, and then it's forgotten as time goes on. So I would just, re-emphasize that.
And presumably a lot of what you see, Vicky, when you're putting these plans in, they are often exit driven for businesses, particularly in the early stage life sciences sector.
Yes, I would say for EMI, the majority of them are exit based, and they come as part of a wider package. So again, it's that holistic view in terms of, what are the triggers? EMI is really flexible in its design. So you can have numbers of performance conditions, whether that's, company sale values or other targets. So commercially, it's always good to kind of take a step back and and really think about what you're trying to achieve from your share plans.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And just one final question for you, Vicky. I'm conscious need to bring Ian in a minute just to talk about accounting. But in terms of kind of common pitfalls that you see with incentive plans, are there any things that if people are putting these in that they really should be looking out for to make sure that they don't inadvertently do something unhelpful?
So if I'm talking about EMI, I would say some of the common pitfalls are, forgetting to register the options with HMRC. That would be a big no-no and very expensive, because you lose your tax benefits. There are some interesting changes coming in place for the EMI plan that kind of ease some of the administration. But again, I think it comes back to employee communication and really making sure that what you have in place is effective and people remember what you've got. Yeah, so making sure that at the start you really have a think about what is the overall kind of package for somebody. So, the worst conversation is when somebody, an owner, gives away something under EMI and then a few years later says, oh, now I need to bring in place this new talent and actually I don't have enough of my share pool left. How do we deal with that conversation? So it's trying at the start to see where the company is growing to, what you need to kind of reserve in that share pool, what you can do. So and having that wider conversation with somebody like David.
Sounds good.
It's just worth adding to that, if I just a sentence, which is the confusing thing about some of this is it's not static. So if we think about what was important and what is important in the context of driving people to change employer or to look for a new opportunity, when you roll the clock back to 2019, that would have been when we all talked about purpose and how it was really important to find an employer with purpose. By 2020, it's about safety. We're in the midst of a pandemic. Is my employer really looking after me? By 2021, you've got the whole hybrid working debate going on. It's a totally different premise on what good looks like. 2022, you've got a cost of living crisis. It's about what are you doing with base pay. So by 2023, you could say, well, heaven knows, where are we now? It might be the case that the thing to disproportionately focus on, somewhat counterintuitively, is not pay at all, which is what I think is due for reevaluation is career progression and experience, and for all intents and purposes, the opportunity for people to become as successful as they possibly can in an organization. So there may be some easier wins in here outside of pay because it's time that they were given their look. That's what an employee value proposition does. It comes and goes, to be perfectly honest. And who knows what 2024 will offer, but for all intents and purposes, we shouldn't be surprised that it's something completely different. That's just how this cycle works.
Have you got any predictions as to what it might be? Crystal ball gazing.
So, I mean, I would say that one of the things which we haven't touched on at all, but is going to become a massive issue for organisations over the next couple of years, is showing that the way they pay is fair. So pay transparency. Can you be absolutely honest that paying that person and that person the same or different amounts of money is the right thing to do? So if we assume that instead of absolute numbers, we'll be much more focused around relativities internally and externally, we'll not be a million miles away from what will become the next big noise. We have the EU Pay Transparency Directive that's hit. It's not hit us because we're not in the EU, but if we have any organisation with a footprint in the UK and in Europe, they will comply with that. So we will see the impact of that hit in the UK, because most organisations, to be honest, have to have a footprint outside of the UK at the same time as being in the UK, for reasons I should not go into, but which are, just a factor of taking some of the decisions that we have taken. He says nebulously.
David, just wanted to add to that from our own personal experience when we're hiring into the audit and accounting profession, and maybe that's a 2023 factor or 2024 is working for a company that's really focused on sustainability and your point around fair pay, ED&I more broadly. Every person I speak to who's coming either straight out of school at 18 or graduates out of university, they always mention both of those things. And so that is a huge factor in deciding which companies to apply to work for, as well as pay and all of the traditional elements. So for me, I think that is certainly a big factor for this year and going forward.
The really interesting development, it's the harder edge of purpose. So if you think back to 2019, we talked about conceptually working for an organization that was doing a good thing. Actually now people are saying, show me what you're doing and pay transparency, your journey to net zero, what's happening with scope 3 emissions. That's what purpose is now. Show me what's happening, not what you've put in your fancy slide deck. It's quite interesting how it's evolved.
Really interesting. Ian, you jumped in a very timely moment then. Paul, I think, alluded to the fact that certainly long-term incentives and share options and things are often overlooked in terms of accounting consequence. They're not free. What sort of things should businesses be thinking about around that?
Yeah, sure. Just spend a few minutes on this, and I think we've got a slide with some considerations that I can run through. I think just picking up on what Vicky, Paul, and David have said. Share options are not free, but they do not represent a cash cost in terms of the option itself. And to all the discussions around how you tie people in for a period of time in terms of the sort of behaviours that you want and the right people that you want in the organisation. This is generally a 1, 2, 3, 4 year period of time. And I think the key point here is that there are some real cash costs of issuing share options, and I'll let you talk at the end, Carol, on tax, but they generally tend to be tax-based in terms of perhaps national insurance, which is paid at the end on exercise of these options. But there are some benefits also at that point in time around some deductions available to the company for the employees exercising options once they've vested. So there are some costs, but the accounting charges booked in the financial statements every year, they are not cash costs for the business, which is a positive. But it's certainly the case in life sciences companies that non-cash accounting charge can be material, can be significant to such an extent it can sometimes dwarf the real research and development spend and operational spend of a business. And certainly having worked in the US many years ago, that certainly was the case, particularly where options were a significant portion of the package. But just in terms of a few points to look out for when you're trying to account for options, everyone will have heard of the Black-Scholes valuation, these chaps that came up with a way of valuing options that don't have a real world fair value, and it's a fairly well established model. They are certainly that's a fairly standard model available to be used for non-market vesting conditions, but sometimes, particularly for AIM listed and main market listed companies, there might be some performance conditions that relate to the underlying share price of the business growing over a period of time. And those are called market vesting conditions and require a different valuation approach. Monte Carlo or Lattice are models that are regularly used. Those aren't models that you can download from the internet and work through yourself as a business. They tend to involve a specialist to put those together for you. So, and there are many companies that can do that, but just to bear that in mind when you're determining what those conditions might be. Just in terms of the valuations themselves, private businesses tend to have a bigger challenge when it comes to the underlying share fair value that's included in those valuation models, because they can't point to a market price on AIM or the main market. They tend to use the most recent price at which shares were issued for cash to investors, and that's fine if that's occurred, reasonably recently before the issue of new options. But as time moves on, that value may not necessarily be appropriate anymore, particularly if there have been some significant value inflection points, successful clinical trials, a product actually getting approved, and commercial sales starting. So clearly that's an option for a private company, but if there isn't a close fundraising, then you are talking about, again, doing an underlying value of the business itself to generate that share price, which again, specialists will help you to do, but can be quite costly. The other element is volatility, which I think is a little bit more straightforward. Again, volatility of share price is a fact for fully listed businesses in terms of their own share price history. But for private companies, again, that's not available. So generally what's used is, let's find some peer group companies that are on AIM or a market and use the sort of average of those historical volatilities that are available for those peer group companies. So just a couple of thoughts there on how you build that valuation. Once you've valued your options, you need to spread that non-cash charge over a period of time, and generally it's spread over the vesting period. The one pitfall that many companies fall foul of is the extent to which the vesting is a cliff vesting model, i.e. all of the options vest at the end of 4 years, let's say, and if somebody leaves before that time, then all of the options lapse. That used to be called the European option model, or as came from the US particularly, where oftentimes employees don't stay with the business for more than a couple of years on average, possibly 3. The options vest more regularly and more frequently, so monthly, quarterly, or annually, and the vesting model changes there from a straight line model under cliff vesting to, it's called an accelerated model, where you look at each tranche that vests and spread the charge for that tranche over that individual tranche's vesting period. That takes a little bit more modeling to do. It still can be done in Excel, but when you've got large numbers of employees, a software package tends to help with that particular calculation. So just a few thoughts there on the accounting. Really, the key here is you've got to get the commercial model right for the options, and then the accounting will follow. I certainly don't think the accounting should drive the decisions around options and their the underlying vesting characteristics, but it's just a level of compliance that needs to be dealt with. Carol, do you want to just pick up on the tax side?
Yeah, no, I certainly can do. So on the tax side of things, there's a deferred tax aspect to think about that can be quite messy and needs sort of preparation. So you have to look sort of grant by grant at how that's going to work out. The second point to note, which Ian alluded to, is that when options are exercised, you can usually get a deduction for what we call the spread on exercise as a company. So if your shares at the time of exercise are worth 100, say, but you only paid £1 for them, then that 99 should be a deduction for the company. And we find, particularly in transaction situations, that can be quite a big number, and needs careful management, actually, if you are going through, say an exit, and to make sure that the benefit sits with the party that you intended to sit with, for example, and that everybody knows exactly what that deduction looks like, yeah, can consider the impact of it. So a lot to think about on tax. So I think that leaves us just shy of 10 minutes for questions for anybody in the audience. So have we got any questions? I've not seen any come in, I don't think, but if you have any, please do pop it in the chat. And just while we're waiting for any questions, Vicky, there was a valuation aspect that came out of Ian's comments just now, and I know tax valuations can be quite different. I wondered if you just wanted to share a few thoughts on that while we wait for some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So tax valuations, typically, if we're looking at, say, the tax approved plan, so EMI and company share option plans, we can actually go to HMRC in advance of an award to get those valuations agreed with HMRC. And in particular, you know, if you're using, say, a different share class, or there's different rights for investors, maybe the kind of the commercial valuation that investors have paid, you can usually discount that for kind of minority interests, lack of liquidity. So there is a real difference between what is the commercial valuation of a company and what is the tax valuation for employee awards, which can be really key in kind of ensuring that additional benefit for the employees. So definitely, where possible, you know, agree those valuations with HMRC. For the unapproved or the non-tax advantage share plans, or growth shares, then you can't necessarily agree them with HMRC unless you can do growth shares in association with EMI, which is still a possibility. So there are potential ways of looking at it, but yeah, the valuations are a little bit different for you know, the different types of share plans.
Great, thanks, Vicky. No questions yet. It looks like a couple of people might be having a bit of a problem with the chat. I think I am no technical guru by any means. Apparently, you just need to type it into the chat box, but it's possible that there might be a problem with that if you're trying.
I think Carol,
question here.
Q&A box.
Perfect. Yes, here we go. Question just come through now. Could you touch on the potential aspects of employees being abroad? Who wants to pick that one up?
So I can speak about it from a share plan perspective. So as soon as the individuals are internationally mobile, life gets hard. And I think Paul mentioned that earlier. You can have kind of trailing liabilities and in effect, potentially lots of different issues to pick up in the countries that they visited. Shameless plug for another series of podcasts, but there is a separate series of podcasts on kind of the international home working, international mobile employees. So I think it might be useful to circulate those details as well, because the international piece is covered in that, and I don't think we'd cover it in a minute. But David, you look like...
Well, look, I've sat forwards. Let's just see what absolute gem I've got as a possibility sitting forward. So just the one thing, it's just probably worth touching on, which is we have been doing some work with clients on, I mean, pretty groundbreaking, I think, work from anywhere policies, which is if you are going to enable your employees to work on a much more flexible basis, how would you do that? And I suppose the model that is taking hold, if you are minded to let your employees work from anywhere, is a kind of traffic light system, I suppose. There will be some countries, let's call them red, where it's simply not possible for you to let people work from there for any purpose. So ultimately, that's off the table. And if someone wants to, they can't. We've got a list of countries or there may be a growing list of countries which I'll call amber, which is as long as you're not there for very long, and there's a question around what you define as long, but very prudent places would say I'll let you have a fortnight, and others might say you can have up to a month. That's something we can do as long as you are comfortable as an individual that you have a right to work there, which is a question in its own right. Now, there are some countries, and there may be those places where you have an establishment already, so there's no queries around corporate tax, or there may be places where you've already got populations comfortably working, that you can call green, and you may enable people to work in those places at their will for a longer period of time. And it doesn't make any of the tax complexities go away, doesn't move trailing liabilities, it doesn't stop you having immigration questions, but actually what we are spotting out there now, particularly for organisations which have a material global footprint, is a much more facilitated conversation around mobility that doesn't go anywhere near, please can I go on assignment, or we'd like you to go on assignment, because that's what we used to do 4 years ago. Now we have something which is much more candidate driven, I think, employee driven, as in I'd like to do this for this period, how can we make that work? So just something to think about, I think.
Great, thanks, David. I had another question in. If my company has nothing in place for long-term incentives, where should I start? Do you think there are many private companies in that situation? Paul, can I go to you on that one to start with?
I mean, the answer is yes. I mean, I think a lot of companies and early stage companies are non-expert in this. So, you know, and I say this, you know, I'm chair of an early stage company, and, you know, we start from the stage where we want to give incentives. We have part-time employees, we have some full-time employees. You know, fortunately, we haven't got anyone working abroad. So I think there are a lot of companies who need to take early advice, because otherwise, you know, you can get yourselves into a bit of a mess. So yes, I think from, you know, responding to the question, there are a lot of companies who want to do that, and I think Vicky, you talked on that point of making sure you do everything right, because if you put a scheme in that doesn't actually work, or you don't register it with HMRC, you could get into big problems. So I don't want to do a sycophantic plug for BDO, but I think if I was in that situation at an early stage, your organisation would be one of the type of organisations I would want to be knocking on the door, just to make sure we got things right, and also looking at what is potentially out there, because I think a lot of early stage companies have this idea they want to give incentives but don't quite know how to do it.
Perfect. I'm very conscious of time. That is drawing us to the close of our hour. So it remains for me to say thank you ever so much to our panelists. That was a really interesting discussion. And thank you to all of you for joining this webinar as well. Hopefully you found that really useful. And if there are any questions that occur to you afterwards, or that we haven't been able to answer today, please do get in touch, and we'll be happy to pick those up with you. So that draws the webinar to a close. Thank you very much, and have a lovely rest of the day.
Thanks, Carol.